All right, good morning. Check, check, check. Can anyone hear me? Thanks, Charles. Hello.
Hi. Say hi, Buck. Come here. Oh, say hi, Buck. Say hi.
Oh, hello. Hello, hello. Oh, look at that. Look at the tail is like making your background like go in and out. Awesome.
Oh.
All right, guys. We'll wait a couple more minutes. We usually start courses around 5 after when start time, but we're definitely going to wait until David Paine logs in because you guys don't want to hear me talk about architecture. I know less about architecture than I know about real estate, so we'll hang on just a little while longer. While we're waiting for David, I'm going to do a little testing of my screen share. Teddy usually drives these things, so sorry you get me today while he's out looking for Poncho the sea lion. So while we're waiting for a few more folks to get on, I'm going to test a little share screen and show you where some of these where these resources are housed. So if you're looking for the video afterwards or the handouts or slides or anything like that, I can show you where. I think I can show you where they're going to be. All right. Let's see. I've got a message. Okay. All right. David says he's trying to get into the meeting. I was on along another. I'm going to have to put you guys on pause. Hold on. All right. So David says there's another meeting going on. So let me see if I can fix this. All right. I apologize for the technical difficulties. It's operator error for sure. So hang tight. All right, I hate to do this to you guys, but there seems to be some two different um, Zoom links that have gone out. One's on the calendar and one's just went out as a reminder. Um, this meeting ID is, did everyone who's on the call right now get a text reminder for join us today? Is that how you joined in, or did you join from the calendar? Anybody? From the calendar? Okay, thanks. That's where I joined it from too. So hate to do this, but I'm going to need to end this Zoom call and you guys are going to need to log back in because basically we have two different Zoom links that are out there. Does everyone have the text reminder on their phone? Calendar. All right. Hold tight before you go anywhere. Okay, I think we have everybody now except for David, and so he's going to try to join this meeting. Again, I apologize for the issues. We'll get started here in just a minute. Hey, David. Okay. I just sent David a different number. I'm so glad this is recording so it can be, kept for all posterity of my incompetence with Zoom. Please be David Paine. Please be David Paine. Please be David Paine. Yeah! Hooray! All right, folks. My apologies again for the delay. That we now have the incomparable and inimitable David Paine has joined us to lead us through part 2 of this Know What We're Selling series, Architecture and Building Styles. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David. Settle in with your coffee and your favorite brunch cocktail that perhaps you learned from his online series, and prepare to have your mind filled with architecture knowledge. All right, David, take it away, and I'm going to work on sharing the screen here to show your slides. Oh, David, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry, there we go. I'm not seeing any faces, so I guess they can see screens, because if they can't, this is going to be pretty shitty. Can't hear you.
All right, I'm sharing my screen now. Can people see some slides?
There's Lon. We need to go back to the first one, just,
Yep.
okay.
Going page up. Not sure how I got there. I could went forward. All
You're
right.
going backward, that's fine.
All right.
Okay, wait a minute. Oh, this is really weird. The first slide isn't there, but that's okay. Just,
I'm going to do this again. Let's go here. All right, now I think I got it now. All right, share screen. Here we go. Share.
okay. And that, okay. That, I don't know what happened. Okay, whoa.
All right, I'm not sure. So the first slide is.
What style is this building?
Yeah. The first slide says, what style is this building?
Yeah.
All right.
And.
All right, so.
I am a little puzzled by that because I don't know. We'll wing it. It's going to be fine.
Okay.
The first slide, or the one that I thought I sent you, had what style is this house, and I had crossed out house and put building under it. And just a little explanation on that. I've done this class, I guess this is 5 times for village. And we've talked about houses and nothing but houses, but I also started doing this at university school, and we broadened it out to buildings, and it became apparent to me that you really can't separate residential and non-residential architecture because they all reflect the same cultural trends and a lot of the same visual styles. So that's, I'm not sure how the first slide didn't make it to you the way I did it, but I think everything else is pretty much the same. Okay. So next slide. Questions about why even are we doing this? And one of the things that prompted me to talk to the brokers about this 5 years ago was that I'm looking at a lot of listings, and it's very clear that realtors don't have a clue. Some realtors don't have a clue about what they're selling. And this little house out in Antioch, I've taken all the information away to keep from, embarrassing anybody. But they're down there, if you can see it, in the description, I have highlighted in yellow, a splendid Frank Lloyd Wright replica. Well, that's not splendid, and it's not a Frank Lloyd Wright replica. That is just flat out wrong. It's a house, and I'm glad somebody ended up buying it. I think that's a closed listing, and hallelujah. But Frank Lloyd Wright, it ain't. So next, we had a condo in, there we go. Condo in this building. This is on West End Avenue. It's built in the 1960s. It's a really swell building. The units are lovely. The exterior style is very nice, but the realtor remark says cool 1960s Art Deco with 2 C's building. Well, 1960s it is, and cool it is. It's not Art Deco, and you spell Art Deco without the hyphen and with 1 C. So this guy, again, nice. I'm sure he's a nice person and his mother loves him, but he doesn't know shit about architectural styles. So, and I'll try to keep the language better, Rebecca. I'm sorry, I saw you. Ooh, okay, so that's, okay, we'll keep it under control. So that's why we're doing this, because I think village agents ought to know a little bit about what they're listing so that you can describe things properly. So thank you, Emily. So next. So background on Nashville architecture. Just generally speaking, Nashville, architecturally speaking, Nashville is not unique. We are, number one, as a community, too new. We developed really in the early stages, but definitely within the age of mass culture. Ideas and fashions traveled pretty rapidly, both across the ocean and around the country. So there's nothing inherently basic to Nashville architecture that's any different from anywhere else in the country. We are Eastern, more or less, and rather generic. There's no strong Spanish or French influence in our culture and therefore in our architecture. So any building you find in Nashville, you can find something pretty similar anywhere else in the country. Okay, next. Another thing to know is that our records are lousy. Consistent building permits don't really exist until the 1970s. They issued building permits, but they were discarded. And so it's hard sometimes without visual evidence to know what you're looking at, and going back into the records probably isn't going to help. The tax assessor site can be wildly inaccurate. Now, going up into the 60s, 70s, then the tax assessor site is probably pretty accurate, but you get back before that, and you will see, if you've been looking at listings and tax records as long as many of us have, there are a lot of building dates that end in 0. That's because at some point when they codified all the tax records, they just said, okay, this one's 1920, that one's 1930, this one's 1940, this one's 1910. We don't really know. And if you know anything about history, what happened in 1929, October of 1929, the stock market crashed. By the early 1930s, almost all economic activity had been curtailed in this country and around the world, and there weren't many houses built in 1930, and sure, really weren't a lot in 31, 32, 33, and 34. There weren't many houses or any kind of buildings built in that time, and so when you see a tax record that says 1930, look at that with a skeptical eye. Okay, next. So also, stylistically, the timeline is general and fluid. In the real world, fashions kind of overlap. We all know this about the clothes that we wear. You can wear last year's jeans and not be hissed at on the street. Things come and go in a fluid, overlapping style. And sometimes that leads to strange hybrids, and sometimes that leads to houses that are built 10 years after the peak of fashion in that design. So we can't always tell exactly by what we're looking at. I think this class is I'm not expecting us to be perfect. I'm just expecting us not to say stupid stuff. That's the best we can get out of this. Okay, One other thing, and that the passage of time makes sense of things. It is really hard to comment, as we all know, on music or literature or any kind of stylistic or even, politics and history itself until the dust is settled and we can look at it in hindsight and say, this is what was going on. So there's a lot of this toward the end of this that are just like, I don't know. So next. So a few terms that I'm going to use a lot or here and there that might be helpful to kind of get in mind. Revive and revival. This has to do, with waking up and bringing back from the past. And this happens in the arts all the time. And it happens in architecture a lot of the time, or it has happened. And it is now, again, happening again. We are reviving styles from the past. As we speak, there are people out there swinging hammers on buildings that are reviving, brand new buildings that are reviving styles from the past. So we will talk about revivals. Classical. Within this context, we refer to ancient Greece and Rome, the civilizations of Greece and Rome that have an awful lot to do with our culture even today. Neo means something that comes afterward. So neoclassical means after ancient Greece and Rome, and that is a revival of, in this context, architectural styles from Greece and Rome. Medieval. That is the period having to do with what we call the Middle Ages or the medieval era. That's sort of roughly, extremely roughly, between the fall of Rome in the early 400s, the end of the Roman Empire as we remember it, classical, to the dawn of the Renaissance, which happens in the late 14th, early 15th century, sort of centered in Italy, but that's also a big overgeneralization. But anyway, that 1,000-year period between 400 and 1400 is generally considered the medieval era. Modern, that is a term we're going to use, but that is a really hard concept to pin down. It is an adjective that describes current or of the moment, but it is also beginning to ossify into a style. We're going to get this settled after I'm dead, and I'm sure most of you will outlive me and you can remember what I said when it all gets settled, and that'll be fine. I won't care. I'll be dead. Next. So a stylistic timeline we're going to run through really quickly before we start looking at buildings. Nashville, the Europeans came to Nashville, this area in the late 1700s. 1779 is the date given for the founding of Nashville, which is really rather egocentric on our part because there were Native American tribes all over the area. None of them were settled here. They moved in and moved out, and the neighborhood called the Nations is named that because that was a place where various tribes would come together to discuss fishing and hunting rights and that sort of thing. And some smart-ass real estate agent tried to rename it Historic Westtown, and thank God that didn't take. I think the Nations is much better and historically accurate. Anyway, 1779 is when the English people came here, and they were still English. Excusez-moi, they were not still English. We had formed ourselves as a country in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, but there was still a war on. So early decades, it's people living out in the woods. So we had a lot of logs, and log buildings don't survive very long. They fall apart. We have very, very little evidence of an original log building. We do have some federal, and I say not colonial because we were no longer colonies by 1800. We have some early federal style buildings. We really get cooking in the 19th century, 1800 on, where there are the political, cultural, architectural currents tended to be reviving the past. Two very specific revival forms, Greek and sometimes Greco-Roman, which has to do with politics, and medieval revivals, which have to do with the romanticism of the arts. Generally, if you know classical music, there is a period of romantic music. There was a lot of romantic novel writing, and we had romantic architecture, reviving particularly medieval styles. corrupt and trashy behavior of classicists and Roman and Greek people who are walking around in togas and going, getting naked at baths and things like that. So then, overlapping with these revivals, we begin to have Victorian styles. And one of the things that people sometimes ask me about, what is Victorian architecture? That's impossible to answer. Victorian is an era. It's named for Queen Victoria, British queen, who sat on the throne from 1837 to her not untimely death in 1901. She was old as hell and cranky and repressed and I don't know, not so good. Anyway, so that's a lot of territory. And so really, technically, anything during her reign could be considered Victorian. There are three, among houses in particular, there are three really strong currents in Victorian architecture, and Queen Anne, Eastlake, and Antagonet, and we will look at all three of those because we have examples of those. Okay, next. Okay, then, again, overlapping 1900 to right up to 1930, when things began to fall apart in the Depression, we have revivals again. Neoclassical revival, which is a revival of neoclassicism, and sometimes for a joke I say neoclassical. We also have colonial revival. We don't have anything here that is colonial, but we revived it here as we did all across the country. Tudor revival and Spanish colonial revival, we will look at all of those. Also, in this same period, there was developing a movement out in California that absolutely swept across the country like rolling out a carpet. That is the Craftsman style. It was more than just a style. It was the architectural style. It was a lifestyle. And we will look at those. We got a ton of that in Nashville. So next. Starting around 1930, and again, all of this is fluid, up to 1970 or so, we have modernism as we are currently describing modernism. Several stylistic currents: Art Deco, 1C, no hyphen, Art Moderne, which was kind of a follow-on, the International style, which was very important in the late 40s through the 60s up into the early 70s, and now is important again because we are beginning to revive that. We have in houses a contemporary or a mid-century modern look, and then we of course have the ubiquitous ranch, which was the Craftsman bungalow of the 50s and 60s. Then going onward from 1970, we have a style that you will see around town that we generally call California Contemporary or California Modern. Then we have postmodernism, which did not filter out into residential architecture very much. And then we have ongoing revivals. And right now we are doing pretty much nothing but reviving historical styles. Okay, next. So a few terms we're going to use, and I'm running late already, so I'm going to blast through this. For the purposes of this class, a column is anything that holds up a porch. They come in all sorts of styles. We got the Parthenon over there on the left. We got a little Craftsman style house on Blair Boulevard over on the right, and a lot of stuff in between. A column is something that holds up a porch. Next. Roof forms, and this gets important. There's a term called pediment, and that is a triangular member supported by columns and an entablature on top of the columns. Right there is the Nashville Parthenon on the left, and below left is Ripavilla Plantation out near Spring Hill. Those triangles there are pediments, unlike these on the right, which are gables, and that is simply a pointed roof without the neoclassical or classical elements, cornice and entablature and everything, and a gable is open at the bottom. There's also an open pediment, and we'll get to that in a minute, and it's not, don't want anybody to get confused. You see the difference between a pediment and a gable, I hope. This, when I do this in person, I make people answer me, but you all can just be there and, you know, do the crossword. Next. So you're remembering the gable. I put a little gable there, that bungalow there on the upper left. Another very, very frequently used, particularly up in the 20th century, is the hip roof, and that is a roof that slants in from all four sides. It sometimes comes to a point. If you will see on this house, this isn't a house in Nashville. I just found a picture representing hip gables. Over there to the left of the garage is an entry porch, and that roof goes up to a point. But up at the very top of the house, it goes up to a ridge. I hope you can see the difference there. Both of those are hip roofs. And then in the Craftsman era, there was frequently used something called a jerkin head gable or a hipped gable. And you see this house right here, it's on 20th, right near the office. There is it looks to like a gable starting, but then they clip it off and do a little hip roof thing at the top. Okay, next. So just for grins, the classical orders, these are what you see, white columns on government buildings, Greek Revival plantation houses, etc. There are three general categories: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, getting fancier as we go to the right. The components of these were strictly governed by tradition. I don't know whether you can see it on your screen there, but over to the right of each of these orders, there's a section labeled A. That is the overall, the entablature. It is held up by the column. There are three elements in the entablature: the cornice, the frieze, and the architrave. You see all of these big time on the Parthenon if you want to go look at it. Inside the Parthenon is the Ionic order in the Treasury building, and the Greeks didn't use the Corinthian order, maybe hardly even at all. The Romans loved it because they were flossy and fancy and out of control. So you will see all three of those orders here around town. And then there is a simple Roman column that isn't on this slide called the Tuscan column, which is very much like an Ionic one right there in the middle, but without the little scrolly things on the top, and often without the flutes, the little grooves in the column shaft. Okay, next. We're going to see a lot of arches, and an arch is a building, a structural system that uses wedge-shaped blocks that push against each other and hold each other up. And an arch always has a central member at the very top or in the very middle called a keystone. And the keystone is what exerts the pressure outward and downward and makes everything stand up. A typical arch is a round arch that we see there at the top. There over on the left is a pointed arch, but there's still a keystone. And then here and there, we see something called a flat arch. And this is over a window in a 20th century building. But if you can look closely, you'll see that those bricks on top of that window slant inward, and there's a stone keystone in the middle. That's every bit as much an arch as the round one. The structural system is the same. Next. So there are a lot of pediments, pediment variations. The Greek and the Roman people would have been appalled at some of this. A standard pointed pediment there is there at the upper left, but they began to play with them. So we have a broken pediment that's open at the top. We can have an open pediment that's open at the bottom. We have a segmental pediment, which is a segment of a circle. And then we can have a broken segmental, and then we have the ever popular swan's neck with an urn there on the lower right. We see a lot of that in residential buildings, and we will see it in the slides to come. Okay, next. So let's look at buildings, shall we? Our early decades, federal buildings, very, very few of these, because I said we were living out in the middle of the woods. Nashville was out in the middle of nowhere. And there were very few people who had enough resources to build anything that would resemble permanent. So a lot of the log stuff is gone. These are two houses out on the south and west sides of town, although there are a couple of others here and there. The one on the left is the Craighead House. It's at the bottom of Richland West End. In fact, Richland West End was sort of built on the front yard of the Craighead House around 1880 1802, 1800. Very rare to have brick. This was a pretty extraordinary and deluxe house for the time and the place. The one there on the right is Traveler's Rest, very similar to the Craighead House in concept, built out of wood, not out of brick. These houses have rustic attempts at high-end style decor inside. But I mean, these were out in the woods houses built by people who had prospered enough to get a house right to come and build a house. There are maybe 10 of these in Middle Tennessee, and that's it. Next. So we get to what we were talking about, the beginning to revive the past. The United States in its early decades and carrying on through to today has always loved to associate itself with this dream of Greek democracy. Ancient Greece was not a democracy. Ancient Greece was a theocracy and a dictatorship, more or less. However, certain people who, if you had enough money and you had you were male, you could, in certain circumstances, cast a vote, and decisions were made by majority vote. There wasn't any evidence of that in history before the Greeks, and so this experiment in representational government that the founding fathers here established looked back. There were, in 1848, there were rebellions and takeovers all over Europe that were aimed at establishing representative governments and taking power away from monarchs. And so the Greek revival was very important in Europe as well. The Germans loved it. The British loved it. If you've ever been to the British Museum in London, it's an astounding example of incredibly pure Greek revival. Here, on the left, we have the real Parthenon, the one that's all toe up. And to the right of that is the Karagic monument to Lysicrates, which is also up in the Acropolis area. I've never been to Athens, so I'm not exactly sure where that is, but it's near the Parthenon. So next, we have the Tennessee State Capitol. And if you look at the lantern, that's a lantern, that's what they call it, instead of a dome up on the very top, and you compare that visually to the Karagic monument of Lysicrates, you will see that the architect, William Strickland, ripped off that design and blew it up by a factor of like 800 and put it on top of the Capitol. What we see here on the Capitol on either end is, I hope that you can see the pediment supported by columns with an entablature in between. Very, very pure example of Greek revival, begun in the 1840s when Nashville was still pretty much a hick town out in the sticks, and it would be like Smyrna hiring I.M. Pei to come in and build the courthouse. It was audacious. And William Strickland came here from Philadelphia, which was at the time a big fancy town, and he had designed a number of very important buildings. He had a national, if not international, reputation. And here he came to Nashville to design and construct this fabulous building. It's one of the best state capitals we've got out of 50. Next. And here is the Nashville Parthenon, the one that ain't all toe up. And this was built for the centennial exposition for the centennial of Tennessee's statehood in 1897. And this is late in the game for Greek revival architecture, but it speaks to the spirit of the time and America wanting to associate itself with Greek democratic ideals. Next. So this filtered out into domestic architecture. These are two big fancy examples. I doubt you will, I know you'll never list Belmont Mansion there on the right, because I doubt the college would sell it to you, to anybody. Ripa Villa there on the left down near Spring Hill. You know, that'd be a cool listing if the House Museum people ever turned loose of it. But this did filter out into smaller houses as well. These are good examples of how the historic forms were used. The typical white column front porch there on Ripavilla with the pediment, with the entablature, with some pared down Corinthian columns. On the right, Belmont, both of these houses date back to the early 1850s. Hot zone for Greek revival. The Belmont architect did not use a pediment, but those are two very fancy Corinthian columns there at the inset. That is an inset front porch, and those columns are called inantis. That won't be on the test. That's just a little sidelight. And then they have two projecting porches on either side with a flat cornice and not topped by a pediment. Both very good examples of pulling the Greek forms into domestic architecture by people who were rich and had enough money to really do it upright. Next. Now, again, reviving. That was a politically based revival, understanding that this had to do with politics, this had to do with the nation's concept of itself. Then we also get into this idea of romanticizing the past. I'm here to tell you the medieval era really sucked. It was dirty, it was disease-ridden, it was violent. There were incredible violent upheavals all through the continent of Europe. The medieval era was a mess. There were a lot of incredible flowering of literature and art, but they were dodging arrows and battle axes while they were doing it. That was a really crappy time to be alive. I'm glad I'm living now. However, in the 19th century, as a reaction against the age of reason, Voltaire and all of that falderall, against the assuming cosmopolitanism and corruption of the Renaissance, we moved as a culture into an age of romanticizing the past. So there is a style of building an era in medieval Europe called the Romanesque. That is a completely incorrect term. Early architectural historians, art historians in the late 19th century looked back and they saw all of these, they saw all of these round arches. And just as a little side note, the Romans invented the arch. There had never been an arch before Rome started building aqueducts. And they thought this looked like Rome, and so they called it Romanesque. The key to this style of architecture, recognizing it, is that it is heavy, it is built out of stone, and everything looks like a fortress. During that time, there was no domestic architecture that was permanent was ever built. The only thing that was built domestic that was permanent was a castle, and that was also a fort. And they built a lot of churches. And the churches look like forts. This is, I could not find in my notes the name of this church. These are both in France. And one is a cathedral in a town I cannot find the name of. I found the photo and I can't find the name of the town. The other one on the right is the cathedral at Angoulême, both in France, both in the 10th century and the 900s. And to me, they both look earthbound, heavy. Those windows look like arrow slits, and they may have been arrow slits at one point or another in the history of the building. So that is authentic Romanesque. Next slide, we get to where we are reviving it in America. I hope everybody knows what this building on the left is. That's Union Station. And what a great, a brand new architectural need is a railroad station. There hadn't been railroad. This was built in 1900. There were no railroads 100 years before this building was built. There were very, very few 50 years before this building was built. We have a brand new style building need. And so they dressed it up in the most impressive, most permanent, most forbidding, and get out of my way, I'm coming through kind of style. And that would be Romanesque revival. If you look at the tower on the Union Station, you will see it looks very much like the tower on those churches. Heavy stone, narrow windows, big and imposing, and frequently made out of stone. We don't have many surviving Romanesque revival houses in Nashville. We do have a few. They were built all over the country, particularly in cities that were richer than Nashville was at the time, when people could accumulate large fortunes. So we see a lot of that in the Northeast and along the Rust Belt, where the Industrial Revolution had made a number of people extremely rich. This house here, you see the brick and the stone, and you see the heavy arch there at the door, and the little turret on the side that looks like it came off of a castle. All of those are indicators of Romanesque revival. The house there is on 4th Avenue North in Germantown. And so next. Another Romantic revival is the Gothic style, and historically this followed on Romanesque. It is also a misnomer. It had nothing to do with the Goths who invaded Europe and helped destroy the Roman Empire. People in the Renaissance named Gothic architecture Gothic because they thought it was barbaric, and the Goths were all barbarians, even though most of them had been converted to Christianity before they attacked Rome. Anyway, what the Gothic did very specifically was to open up the heavy fortress-like Romanesque buildings and let in light. These two pictures are from the Abbey of Saint-Denis outside of Paris. It's in Greater Paris. You can get there on the subway. The picture there on the left is the facade, the west facade of the Abbey of Saint-Denis. That is a Romanesque building. I think all of you would agree, based on what I said before, that looks pretty Romanesque. What the picture on the right is the choir and ambulatory that was built on the back of the building, and look at how big those windows are. This was all started by the abbot of the Abbey Church, Abbot Suger, who had theories about the divine qualities of light. Light was an indication of the divine presence and the presence of God, and he wanted to open up the walls and fill them with windows. So next. And this, it's very, very rare. I talked about timelines being fluid and loosey-goosey. It's rare that we can have somebody blow a whistle and say, okay, here's the first example of anything. But the additions that Abbot Suger put on the back of that church were built around 1135, and that's when somebody blew the whistle and said, okay, it's Gothic now, Romanesque is over. Over the next 100 years, the Gothic style flowered into fantastic buildings. The picture on the left is the cathedral at Amiens in France. This started in France, but it spread all over Europe. And I think it's obvious from this photograph how much more open that building is, even though the basic forms are the same. There are 2 towers, there are 3 doors, there's a nave in the middle. But look, you can see daylight through the towers. Can you see the little bits of blue? Look how much wider the openings are there at the doors, and how many more windows there are, and all this filigree and stuff. This building was built remarkably fast. This building was built, it only took them 50 years. Usually it took a couple of 100 years to get one of these done. And by the way, this is Notre Dame d'Amiens. We talk about Paris. The cathedral in Paris is Notre Dame. Well, that means Our Lady in French, for those of you who didn't go to French class in high school. And there are Our Lady churches all over France and all over everywhere else. And there's a Notre Dame in like every other town. This is Notre Dame d'Amiens, as opposed to Notre Dame de Paris. So that's a sidelight. Ultimate expression of the Greek style, flowering of the Greek style, is the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. It was the Royal Palace Chapel. Can you see the little tiny people down at the bottom of that slide? Look how tall that room is. And it is like 70% glass. Today, this would all be built out of metal. That's not metal, that is stone. Every bit of that is stone. The roof is stone, the vaulting is stone, but glass. Ultimate, Abbot Suger would have lost it if he had seen this, if he had lived to see it. And it really was only 100 years after his death. Next. So, coming to America, coming to this city, we have some examples of Gothic revival architecture. mostly churches, because that's mostly what got built in the Gothic era in Europe. This is the Assumption Church in Germantown, built in 1858-ish. Adorable little church, not a big fancy church at all. So sweet and lovely, but you see the pointed arches. I didn't really go into that, but one of the clues that you can use to say, okay, is this Romanesque or is this Gothic, is Romanesque tended to have round arches, Gothic had pointed arches, and that was because Abbot Suger wanted to raise the roof and open up the walls, and a pointed arch does that a lot better than a rounded arch. You can go taller in the same width. So inside of the Assumption Church, those electric lights were added obviously in the 20th century, but I just, adorable is the only word I can use for this building. I just love it. But you see the pointed arches and the slender columns on the inside, a lot of open space, not heavy, not dark, big windows. Next slide. So the Episcopalians do a real good job on church building as a rule, and left us with some really swell ones here. This is Christ Church Cathedral on the left at the corner of 9th and Broadway. The Church of the Holy Trinity on Lafayette. Both recreate the one on the left, Christ Church, is highly eclectic. It borrows and mixes and matches from all kind of variations in the Gothic style. It's a mishmash. It's a glorious mismatch. And honey, the organ will knock your socks off in there. It's, you know, it's why I go to church. On the right is typical of a lot of smaller Gothic Revival churches all around the country. Stone, much more compact, lovely woodwork on the inside, and a very accurate recreation of a British parish church out in the Cotswolds or somewhere like that. Next. And this style also filtered out into non-institutional and buildings, non-religious buildings. On the left, we have the Customs House, built in 1875-6, and then added on to. But you see that tower there? They just yanked that right off a church somewhere and stuck it on the Customs House. This was built as a federal office building. On the right, we have Kirkland Hall at Vanderbilt, which was built in a very eclectic but somewhat Gothic style. You see the pointed arch, you see the columns leading into the door, you see the little spindles on either side. Very, very much part of the Gothic aesthetic. The top of the building burned off in 1905 and they rebuilt it in a different style, so it's kind of a mess, but it's there. Next, we will finally get to houses. We had very, very few. Gothic Revival was a domestic architectural style, big time in the Northeast in particular, but it did filter out to us. The painting there is Grant Wood's American Gothic. I hope everybody who pretends to be educated has seen that. And in the background, this is from the Middle West, farm country, but in the background, there's a little house with a little pointed arch, pulled all the way from the Cathedral Amiens to 1890 or 1910 on the plains in America. Two examples of Gothic Revival-esque houses. This one on the left is 606 Followen Street. This was the first house I ever owned. I bought it when I was 26. In 1978 for $38,000, 4,300 square feet of challenge. It is, the owners now who have it have done a very good job of taking care of it and actually advancing the restoration somewhat. What we see that are characteristics of the Gothic Revival style are up at the eave line. There are single board width gingerbread trim. It's called barge boards. It's cut in the form of a maple leaf. It's hard to see, I know, on your computer screen, but it's there. And it is different from what comes later in that it is two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional wood trim. On the right over there is a house on 24th or 20, what? I've got it in my notes here. 25th Avenue, between Blair and Barton. built before the area was subdivided. This was built for actually the Episcopal bishop in this part of Tennessee. That was his house, built somewhere in the mid 1800s. The one on the left was built somewhere between 1858 and 1868, because we know it wasn't there in 1868. That's all we know. So we need to move on from that. I don't want to spend too much time on it because we don't have that much of it. Next, yeah. So what we do have a good bit of is the Queen Anne style. Don't even get me started on why this is called Queen Anne. I don't know. It's not a drag queen. It's not a queen of England. I don't know who Anne was. I sort of do, but it is really dubious. Just go with me. This is Queen Anne. And Queen Anne Victoria, this is a Victorian style, one of many, starting in the middle of the 19th century and lapping over into the early 19th. Queen Anne houses came in all sizes. They came in all materials. The one on the left is brick. The one on the right is wood siding. The one on the left is 122 South 12th, and you can just throw a rock from the front yard of this one and hit the one on the right, which is at corner of Holly and 12th. It's 1113 Holly Street. What is characteristic about these houses is the wooden trim has become three-dimensional. They're knobs and spindles and lathe-turned wood. They are very irregular in shape. The one on the left is a good example. We've got a projecting bay with a gable at the top on the left, and there's another one on the right side at the back, and there's that circular turret with the little domed roof, and the porch that goes around the corner. That's a big typical feature of Queen Anne style architecture, is a porch that goes around the corner. You'll see it again and again and again. This one here, the smaller, more modest house on the right. Same thing though, there's a projecting form with a gable on the left side of the facade, and then the porch wraps around and meets another one that projects on the other side. And we have that ornate three-dimensional trim on the porch. Next. A similar, but not exactly the same variation is the Eastlake style. And once again, the name, just forget about why it's called that. I used to know back when I was in college. I don't anymore. Eastlake is very similar in form. You'll notice all the irregularities, and the one on the right, which is also on Holly Street, the one on the left is in the 500 block of Fauveland Street. All dating from the 1875-ish years. What distinguishes Eastlake is, number one, it is never masonry. It is always wood. The foundations are generally stone or brick, but I mean, how could they be otherwise? But the superstructure is always wood. The porch almost never wraps around the corner. I don't know why that is. It just is. And the woodwork is completely out of control. Layer upon layer upon layer of heavy encrusted wedding cake kind of decoration. That is characteristic of the Eastlake style. We don't have a ton of this, but we do have some, and you may get a listing. Robbie Drimmer has just put a coming soon on the one on the right there that was owned for many years by friends of mine who moved to California 2-3 years ago and did not ask me to list it. I'm still friends with them, but it's probational. So Robbie Drimmer's, that one's got to come in soon. It is a fabulous house. Pretend you have a client and go preview it if you don't have a client to preview it for. Anyway, next. So another style that we see a lot of here is the Italianate style. And the thread between how this looks and the word Italian is pretty iffy, but maybe a little less obscure than Queen Anne. Typical earmarks of this style are the eyebrows over the windows. You see them? Those arches, and sometimes they're flat, heavy eyebrows over the windows, and a projecting cornice at the top. You see that on the building headed toward the right, you see that heavy projecting cornice. Next slide. This is another one. These are all on 2nd Avenue. Heavy eyebrows on the windows, projecting cornice. Those are the earmarks of commercial buildings in the Italianate style, and this translates very directly into houses. Next. Here are two really good examples. The one on the left is in WeHo on Humphreys. Is it Humphrey Street? Yeah, I think it's Humphrey Street. Yeah, 440 Humphreys. The one on the right is also in the 500 block of Fatherland Street, right next door to the East Lake we just saw. And I hope you can see the connection. Heavy projecting cornice, eyebrows over the windows, similar designs in the porches, and like the East Lake, unlike the Queen Anne, the porch almost never wraps around the corner. So if you see a porch wrapping around a corner, it's going to be a clue. Okay, we're going to call this Queen Anne. If it doesn't, we're going to think about East Lake. We're going to think about maybe Italianate. Like the Queen Anne, you can get an Italianate house built out of stone, out of brick, out of wood. They were all over the map, and they get bigger than this one on the left and smaller than that one on the right. You can see little Italianate shotgun houses in Germantown. Next. And I don't have a slide here, but if anybody's familiar with the Donaldson area, Two Rivers Mansion, which is now owned by the city, and it's part of Two Rivers Park and High School and McGavock High and all that. That is also an Italianate Victorian house on the grand plantation scale. So moving forward then into the 20th century, again, roughly, the dates are rough, 1900 to 1930, we have a return to revival style. The Victorian variations were highly creative. They mixed and matched and borrowed from this place and that place and put stylistic elements together in new creative ways. It was ornate, it was extremely creative, and it was not exactly typical of anything from the past. Starting, as styles do, things come, things go. People are always looking for something new. Starting around 1900, toward the end, Queen Victoria cranked out finally in 1901. So around 1900, going up to the onset of the Depression, we have 3 decades of a lot of stylistic revivals. And the first and perhaps most important in terms of all styles of building is the neoclassical revival. So as a review, there on the left is an artist's rendition of the Parthenon, the real one, not the one that we have here. So that is classical. That's the real McCoy. On the right is a neoclassical building. That is the garden facade at the Hermitage. The one that we all see and know is the entry facade. This is the garden facade. And I use it because it has, what does it have there? It has a pediment. It has columns supporting an entablature that it supports the pediment. That is neoclassical. It is reviving the Greek classical. So next, we are re-reviving neoclassical or neoclassical revival or neo-neoclassical. Nobody uses that term but me, but I think it's pretty accurate. This is the Masonic Temple at the corner of 7th and Broadway. And I hope it's pretty obvious that, we've got classical columns. They're actually not detached columns, and therefore they're called pilasters, but that's not another one you'll need to remember for the test. But they are ionic, the ionic order, and they signal that this is a classical revival, a neoclassical revival building supporting that big entablature with the cornice. And there on the back, you see on the right side up at the top is the penthouse building that housed, I'm sure, elevator equipment and heating and wasn't cooling in 1910, but heating equipment. And they decorated it up with a little pediment with little acanthus leaves goodies like they have at the top and the corners of the Parthenon. Again, signaling this neoclassical revival. Next. This is the Carnegie Library in East Nashville, there at the intersect where Gallatin Road comes into Main Street or vice versa, across from East High School. Very, very heavy duty neoclassical revival, that pediment at the top, those columns, and very heavy pilasters supporting the entrance facade. And interestingly, because I pointed this out before, the windows, 2 and 2 on either side of the entrance, if you'll look up at the top, you'll see that we have flat arches. Can you see the keystone at the top? Those wedge-shaped stones, those are arches that are flat across the top. Next. This is, I can't remember and I can't find in my notes the actual name of this building, but this is the building at the top of the Peabody Grand Lawn. I can't even say what they call it. The Esplanade is what it's called. Again, coming back in the early 20th century, this building dates to around 1915 or so. A row of Corinthian columns supporting a very heavy entablature. Not Greek revival, because what's that up at the top? That is a dome. The Greeks didn't know from domes. The Romans invented the dome. And so we can't call this Greek revival. We've got to call it Roman revival or something because it's got a dome. So next. So houses, right? So we have a transition. Nothing happens all of a sudden. We always have a transition. And here on the left, we have a Queen Anne. Does that look like the Queen Anne I showed you before on 12th? It's turned the other way. The porch goes around the other corner, but otherwise, I'll guarantee you the floor plan of these two houses is almost identical, but look at the decorative elements. Those are little Tuscan Roman columns, not fancy gingerbread columns. There is on the turret, underneath the cap there's a little element, and it's going to be really almost impossible to see, but I guarantee you it's there. There is a garland, a flower garlandy thing that was rendered in stone on ancient buildings and big institutional buildings, and here is rendered in wood, but that is a neoclassical element. The window there to the right has an arch, a Roman arch. And this house, that's 800 block of Russell Street. This house over here in East End is at the corner of 12th and Gartland. It is almost identical in floor plan to the other smaller Queen Anne I showed you. The porch wraps all the way around the corner, but it's got little Roman Tuscan columns. And look at that up at the top. We've got a little temple form. We've got a Greek or Roman pediment supported by columns. So we are transitioning out of Queen Anne into neoclassical revival, but still building pretty much the same houses, just with a little more fashionable decor. Next. So the big flowering of neoclassical revival in domestic architecture here, as well as all over the country, is a brand new house form called what? The Foursquare. How many thousand Foursquares are there in Davidson County alone? It may be in the hundreds. I don't know, maybe 1,000 plus. They were built all over the country, all over town. They were built everywhere. And it was a new building form in terms of a new floor plan style, but they tricked it up for the most part with neoclassical revival elements, decorative elements. And so we're going to find Foursquares everywhere, and you'll know what they are when you see them. When you go to do a listing, you can say, oh, this is a Foursquare, because what is that roof form? That is a hip roof form. Sometimes they go all the way up to a point. Sometimes on bigger ones, they go up to a small ridge, but it is always, always, always a hip roof, unless it's not. Typical also is the gable, the attic gable in the dormer, in the middle of the roof, some kind of porch across the front or right at the entry, one or the other, always, until it's not, supported by Greek or Roman revival columns. See that? They come in all sizes. We've got a medium, that's on Blair Boulevard. We've got a large, that's on West End. And next, we've got a Gigunda, that is also on West End. That is still a Foursquare. And we had small ones, little one-story Foursquares that you see all around East Nashville particularly, and other older neighborhoods. That is a Foursquare that's just 1 story tall. That's on Holly Street. Does that make sense? Everybody following along? Holler if you're not. I can't hear you, but holler if you're not. Next. Then we get into, as we move a little farther into the 20th century, we get into reviving specific styles. The Foursquare tends to fall out of style, and we begin to revive actual buildings from the past. Colonial revival, these are both in the Whitland neighborhood. The one on the left is on Craighead, the one on the right is on Whitland, built 1915 to 1925, somewhere in there. As I said, the records are iffy, but pretty larger scale, but pretty good representations of buildings that were built in bigger cities and towns where there was an accumulation of wealth in the colonial and early federal era. We see a good many of these, and they come in big and next. Medium, this one is on Bowling Avenue, and sort of small, and that's on Kirkwood. All of these take their visual cues from actual buildings in the past. And I mentioned the lovely swan's neck pediment with an urn. You'll see one of those right there on the one on Bowling on the left. Okay, going on. So another strong current in American domestic revival architecture is Tudor revival. What it was involving half timber construction. These are real half timber buildings. They're both from France, built in the 1500s. It was a building system that involved constructing a wooden framework and then filling in the gaps with masonry and plaster and gravel, rubble, etc. A very heavy building style, and it got the name in our lexicon from Tudor because the Tudor family, that would be like Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, those people, their family name was Tudor, and that was heavy in style when they were sitting on the throne. So somehow it got to be Tudor. Next. We have a good many Tudor revival houses here in Nashville. They came in all sizes, small, medium, large, and extra large. This one on the, and we can move on. You know what they look like. If it's got half timbering, this is not real half timbering, it's fake half timbering, but that's okay. Always using masonry of some sort, brick or stone, combined with the half timbering. This one on the right was on Gale Lane until last year and was torn down for some tacky tall skinnies. This is one of my favorite houses in town, and it's gone. The one on the left is also on Gale Lane. And then moving on, that one on the left is on Bowling and the one on the right is on Woodmont, but all using those same stylistic elements with the pseudo half timbering. Next. One more that we don't see a lot of here, but if you go south of here, you will begin to see a good bit more. This is Spanish colonial revival. And of course, the Spanish Empire impacted the west coast and the southwest of our country, but also was part of Florida. The Spaniards were the first ones who took over Florida from the Native Americans. So Spanish colonial revival filtered up from the south of here. I grew up in Atlanta. There's a ton more of this kind of house in Atlanta than there is here. And you go north of here and you see very little of it at all. Here are two examples. This one on the left is in Little Hollywood, there at the end of Ordway up against Shelby Park. It's just this terrific little enclave of Spanish colonial houses. This one here on the right is on Bowling Avenue, much bigger and fancier. Earmarks are stucco walls and red tile roof and archways. There are more of these out Belmead. There's some Italian Renaissance revival that are very similar, stucco, red tile, but a little different. Anyway, can't do them all. Moving on, you will see a few of these, and if you get a listing in Little Hollywood, you're gonna love it. So what is the mega uber 800-pound gorilla of early 20th century American architecture? And that is the Craftsman bungalow. Millions, I'm not saying thousands, I'm saying millions of Craftsman bungalows were built all across the country. There are thousands of them here. You are going to get a craftsman bungalow listing. If you hang on in this business long enough, you will get one, and you need to know what you're selling. This was not just an architectural style, it was a lifestyle that sort of over the decades turned into an architectural style. It came out of California. A little bit about this. This is the same house. It's hard to photograph because it faces north, and so the front is never in the sunlight. This is on Blair Boulevard, right around the corner from the Hillsborough Village office. Quintessential earmarks of the craftsman bungalow. Usually, originally, wood frame construction. This is covered in cedar shakes. Large, heavy projecting eaves. You see how far the roof sticks out beyond the wall. Often, almost often, supported by those brackets underneath that are called brackets or knee braces. Always a big welcoming front porch, and built on a domestic scale that could be managed without servants. That was a very important thing. The happy housewife, who knows, she may have been miserable, but the happy housewife could manage the house without having to have people do all of the domestic work. They tended to have rather open floor plans. They flowed one room into the other, which was a new concept. And if you go in one of these houses, you frequently will go into an entry room that is sort of a living room, and on one side or the other, or both, are going to be rooms that are separated by glass French doors, making one big openable space. Often you go around an L into a dining area, a dining room that is only differentiated by some half columns. Open concept, the early open concept, and very, very different from anything that had come before. This is the first modern American house. And that's why modern is so hard to pin down, because this was a modern house in 1910, 1915. Also, the first house that you can reliably count on being built with modern systems. All of these houses had indoor plumbing. That was in 1910, that was a deal. Not everybody had indoor plumbing in 1910. All of these houses were electrified. All these houses had central heating. They had a furnace in the basement. Didn't have forced air. It was a gravity furnace. But there was those three elements are pretty much universal in the craftsman building style. Moving on quickly, this came out of California, where trends come from even today. This house is the Gamble House in Pasadena, California, designed by an architectural firm called Green & Green. They designed a bunch of these in Pasadena. This is an amazing house. It's better on the outside. The inside is so dark and so dreary. I was so disappointed when I went there. This is also the professor's house in the Back to the Future movies, by the way. Go back and watch one of those movies and you will see this very house. But the emphasis was on healthy living, outdoor living, bringing the outdoors in, growing your own vegetables, being a friend of the earth. It filtered out via a magazine called The Craftsman that was published by Gustav Stickley. If you've heard of Stickley furniture, it's very collectible. It's built out of oak. I think it's just hideous, but a lot of people love it. A lot of brown. This was a brown style. Brown wood, brown furniture, brown upholstery. It was brown. But uniquely new, uniquely American, servant-free living, healthy living, happy living, and aimed at people of middle income, many of whom had never bought a house before. Our modern concept of the mortgage loan was just developing at this point, and there were millions of people who bought these. They were the first people in their entire, back to Adam and Eve, who had ever owned a piece of property. Very significant. So next. Part of the way they spread was through catalog sales. Sears catalog, as I think most of us have heard about a Sears and Roebuck house. Sears sold them and Montgomery Ward sold them. Also, there were a number of companies that did nothing but sell houses. Aladdin was the biggest. They tended to be in the northern reaches of the Midwest where there was a lot of timber. You could buy a plan and hand it to your contractor. You could buy the house on a boxcar coming to you with all the parts and all the pieces and everything, including the kitchen sink on that boxcar, and you could get a contractor to unload it. Everything was labeled and they could whip up your house. You could buy them either way. Next, here we see some pages from house catalogs, and I hope to you that these two pictures look a lot like what we've been looking at so far, or we'll look at in a minute in terms of, and you can't see the plans. I will send these slides out to you and you can see the plans, but so we need to just kind of move on. We're running behind. So houses in Nashville, they come not in all sizes. They come in small, medium, and medium large. If you get to the point of being a doctor or a bank executive or somebody who's really pushing on into the upper middle and rich class, craftsman was not for you. There was a sort of a class ceiling on craftsmen, and it went to middle class and lower middle class and working class people. Upper middle class on up preferred a colonial revival, a Spanish colonial revival, something else. So this bungalow here on the right is on both of these, the small one and the medium large one are both on Blair Boulevard, is, I'm calling it kind of medium large. That's about as big as a craftsman bungalow ever got. Here and there, in other cities, here and there, there's another one about like this in Richland West End with like 12-foot ceilings. Very, very, very rare. Next. They also came, there's a very typical style that with a story and a half, with this big projecting gable dormer in the front that was actually a room. And then, what's that one on the right?
Foursquare?
It's a four-square. They took off they ditched the white columns and stuck a craftsman front porch on it. And so we do have craftsman four-squares. And you see the hip roof and you see the basic square shape. That's a craftsman four-square. Moving on into the 20th century. Then there are other variations. And I said, I think when I was talking about the original four squares, they always have a hip roof, except when they don't. These two houses, if you've closed at Rudy, you've been in the one on the right and the one on the left. These are basically, they both have craftsman style front porches with those columns that are wider at the bottom than they are at the top. And the open eaves, the overhanging eaves, and that jerkin head gable on the one on the left. These are craftsman style houses that are four-square size and don't have hipped roofs, which goes to my point about styles being fluid and people mixing and matching as they go along. Let's speed on. There are so many craftsman bungalows that come in so many variations. I just picked some so that you wouldn't get limited in your view of this. They came in brick, they came in stone. This one with the jerkin head gables is painted stone, and there's a special place in hell for anyone who paints stone. Just so you know, don't paint brick either. I'm so sick of painted brick. And don't paint it white, for God's sake. Paint it something else. Just, oh my God, I'm so tired of white brick. And it just doesn't honor the architecture at all. And whoever painted this house on Stokes Lane needs to be arrested. I like the purple door, but otherwise. Anyway, next. They even came in logs. This is a house in Cleveland Park. There are 2 or 3 other ones right near it. And if you will look there, I nearly had a wreck trying to turn around and photograph this house. I didn't know it was here, and I just slammed on the brakes and nearly caused an accident. That corner post, that porch post, is not planed and dressed wood. That is a tree trunk that was debarked and trimmed, and they stuck that sucker up there as I just think that is so fabulous. And this, I'm sure, was a kit house. I'm going to bet you, I don't know, but I'm going to bet you that this arrived on a boxcar with all the logs and everything all ready to go. Next. And then this is one that there are very few of these. This is also in Cleveland Park. I love this house with a little bit of Chinese influence with the fretwork you see in the gable ends. We can move on. And then stylistic mashups. As we move into the 1920s, approaching 1930, this house is on Chesterfield or Fairfax, one or the other, and you can't see it. I can't even see it on my screen, so you can't either. But I'll tell you, up there in the dormers, we've got half timbering, which is Tudor Revival. We have moved the front porch around to the side, and the side porch and the two entry porches have Roman Tuscan columns and open bottom pediments. And yet, it has the big, wide, overhanging eaves. So we've got Craftsman, Tudor Revival, and Roman Revival all in one house. And the floor plan is going to be standard Craftsman bungalow. Go figure. Next. So, buzzing right on through so that you know what you're looking at. Another, like Union Station, in 1900, there was a new architectural need. Nobody had needed a train station before, so we had to figure it out. Well, as cities developed and land prices got pricey in town, we began to build up rather than out. And every city of any size at all began to build multi-story buildings, early skyscrapers. This one on the left, both of those pictures of the Hermitage Hotel. The one on the right is the Stallman Building across from the courthouse. What they generally did, because they didn't have any other way to decorate these, they just didn't know what to do with them, they stuck a bunch of neoclassical ornament on them. You see the big heavy cornice projecting off the Stallman Building. You see the columns down at the bottom. There are columns, sort of Baroque columns there at the base level of the Hermitage Hotel. And that was, and here and there in other cities, the Woolworth Building in Lower Manhattan is a wonderful example of Gothic revival being applied to I don't know, that building is like 60 or 70 stories. It was the tallest building in the world for many decades after it was built, before they built the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. So Gothic revival was occasionally used. It was much more typical to do neoclassical. Next. But as we move from 1930 on into our era, well, most of you probably weren't born in the 70s. I certainly was. 1930 to, yeah, I know. I've seen the hands waving. Yes, I know. You're not all babies. 1930 to 1970, we begin to develop something called modern architecture, architecture that does not owe anything aesthetically to a past style. Art Deco, 1C, no hyphen, is a style that began to flower in this country right as the Depression pretty much stopped everything. So we don't have much of it. But we did have this building. This was the Sudicum Building, or the Tennessee Theater Building, located on Church Street where the Cumberland now is. This was demolished for the Cumberland condo building, apartments and condos. And I've had a listing in the Cumberland and it paid for my lunch and I'm really grateful, but that is really not the building that this one was. But you look at it and we see streamline, slickness, self-conscious verticality. There were these lines in between the windows were stainless steel strips of metal that curved over at the top. There are these pointy things at the corner up at the top. Pointy things are big in Art Deco. Nothing like this had ever been seen before. And it came from, the name comes from an exhibition in Paris called the International Exposition of Decorative and Industrial Arts. It took place in 1925, and that is the name that was drafted onto this style, Art Deco. Next. As the Depression marched on, very little got built that wasn't government financed. On the left, we have the courthouse. On the right, we have the Frisk Center, which was built as the main post office. Both of these are Art Deco buildings. Both of them have, there's a big row of white columns on the front of the courthouse, which signal to us that what? It is a government building and we are basing our civilization on ancient Greece and Rome. The Frisk has big American eagles at either portal. The decorative element that I've included there is the sort of the logo for the Frist, and it was taken from decorative panels in the stainless steel doors inside the courthouse, which are still there. They're amazing. And two things that you'll see in Art Deco architecture are zigzags, you see those at the top, and curvy plant forms, you see those at the bottom. That sort of sums up Art Deco decoration. Next. We see it in commercial architecture. This is the Crest Lofts on Fifth Avenue. Moving on. One thing that is always important to remember about Art Deco is it was intensely colorful. We mostly see black and white photographs, and we mostly see black and white movies from that era, and so we don't get a feel for the color. This is the men's room at the Hermitage Hotel. The men's room and the ladies' room were redone in the 1930s. The building was built in 1910, but 20 years later, they redid the bathrooms. After that, the ladies' room was redone again in the 50s and totally messed up. This is the men's room. All of you ladies out there, if you haven't been in this bathroom, get some guy to take you. It is an absolute trip. I've taken probably 100 women in there from time to time. You just knock on the door and say, anybody in here? And you go on in, they're used to it. Teal, celadon green plumbing fixtures, green and black strips of mirror on the walls, red, black, and green terrazzo floors. Absolute freak out. It is stunning. And that is Art Deco big time. Next. This is the Buena Vista School, another example of institutional architecture. You see the zigzags up at the top. We need to keep moving. And so we don't really have any house in Nashville, and there are almost none nationwide that could be called an Art Deco house. We do have some from the late 30s up until the Second World War stopped everything again. So 36, 7, 8 up to 1940 or so, domestic architecture did begin to happen again. And we have something that is kind of a stripped down version of Art Deco. Art Deco was very decorative, decoration. Art Moderne was decoration free and rather smooth, occasionally angular. These are two big houses because at this point, only pretty rich people were building houses yet. This one on the left is on South Sanford Drive, out just beyond Green Hills. The one on the right is outer Belmead on Chickering. And I hope you can see that it looks like an Art Deco building, but there's not any of the fancy work on it. They frequently had metal framed windows. That was a big deal. People hate them now, but because they rusted. Hello, go figure. And there were usually casement windows that swung outward as opposed to double hung that go up and down. Not many of these, but now you know when you see one. Next. Oh, and this began to be seen in institutional architecture as well. This is the Waverly Belmont School, very similar, but about 8 years later than the Buena Vista School, much less ornate. And by the way, everybody needs to drive by this school at night, because if you see those little squares up above the door on either side of those windows, they're glass block, which was a brand new material at the time, and they light up at night. It is absolutely stunning. You just need to drive or walk by and it will fill your heart. Next. Okay, modern. What we're doing now comes from the 1920s in Germany, and art and architecture and all kinds of practical design school called the Bauhaus, established in the eastern part of Germany. This building on the left was built in 1925 to house the school in a town called Dessau, designed by a guy named Walter Gropius, who is one of the leading lights of what is now called the International Style. The building on the right was built in 1928. It was the German National Pavilion at the Barcelona World's Fair of 1928, designed by an architect named Mies van der Rohe, who was on the faculty at the Bauhaus. Nothing but angles and planes. I want to live at the Barcelona Pavilion. I want it to be my private home. I don't care. I'll walk around in my underwear. I don't care if you can see me. I want to live in this box. That is my aesthetic. This is where I feel at home. A lot of people hate this, but it was here and it's back. Next. At the Bauhaus, they designed everything. The chairs on the left are called Barcelona chairs. They were designed by Mies van der Rohe in 1928 for use in the pavilion. The one in the middle, tell me, there's nobody on earth who hasn't seen a knockoff of one of these. It's called a Breuer chair, designed in 1925 by Marcel Breuer, who was also at the Bauhaus. And the one on the right is the Eileen Gray table, designed by Eileen Gray. And one of the interesting things about the Bauhaus was the number of women who were admitted to positions, faculty positions, and positions of authority, which is pretty unusual in the 1920s. All of this came to an end in the 1930s when the Nazis took over and found all of this modernism very threatening. And there were also Jews involved in the administration of the school, and that was a bad combination. Modernism and Jews were not appreciated by the Nazis, and they began to lean on them. They closed the school, and the faculty scattered. Some went to England. Many of them came to the United States and brought their aesthetic ideas with them. Next. And so this was all happening in the 30s when building was depressed and the economy was depressed. And then we went into World War II, which ended finally in 1945, which led to a gigantic explosion, pent-up demand for housing and all kinds of other buildings, because there had been almost 20 years where much got built. So the international style came to America big time in the form of the skyscraper, the glass box skyscraper. The first time a skyscraper didn't have to look to the past for aesthetic inspiration. This is Lever House, designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, it's on Park Avenue in New York. Tell me you've been to see it. This is the most elegant skyscraper I have ever seen in my entire life. I absolutely love it. It's green, pale green glass, just the epitome of elegance to me. Moving on to the Seagram's building, which is more famous, designed by Mies van der Rohe, who designed the Barcelona Pavilion. This is also on Park Avenue. It's kind of dark. I don't think it's as pretty, but it is, as we see, this solid, just blank slab of windows and steel. Form follows function, all of the ideas that the Bauhaus had brought forward to the 1950s. This was built in 1957. Interestingly, just beyond the Seagram's building, you see there is the Waldorf Astoria, which was one of the last Art Deco buildings built before everything completely fell apart. And you see, I mean, the contrast is just astounding. They are less than 20 years apart, but what a difference. Next. So this filtered out to the world at large. We have glass box skyscrapers from the 50s and 60s right here in Nashville, Tennessee. Not so much the 50s. The one on the left is the Snodgrass Tower, which was built by National Life in 1969. The one on the right, 1964, was originally Third National Bank and is now the WeWork building. Next. It filtered out into other forms. This one on the left was a Methodist church in the Cleveland Park Meridian area, which heartbreakingly to me was demolished in the tornado recently. Absolutely cool building. And some of it was left, but they declared that they condemned it and it is now gone. That kills me. So churches, some. On the right is St. Bernard's School, right here in Hillsborough Village, or right there in Hillsborough Village. I'm at home. But very similar, straight lines, strips of windows, flat planes, harking back to the Barcelona Pavilion. This is a school form of the Barcelona Pavilion. And schools like this were built all over the country because all these babies were popping out and we had to have places to put them. Because this was the baby boom era. All the GIs came home from the war and started making babies. I was one of them. I was born in 1951. And I went to a school, elementary school, 2 different elementary schools that looked very much like this. Next. So houses, finally, okay. These are 2 quintessential international style modernist houses. This the one on the upper left is Philip Johnson's glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut. The one on the left lower is the Farnsworth House outside of Chicago, designed again by Mies van der Rohe for his erstwhile girlfriend, and they got into a big fight over the construction and expense of this house and broke up. Too bad, the house is still there and it is totally deluxe, and I wouldn't mind living in either one of these. Next. So finally, Nashville. Okay, we don't have a lot of this. Nashville was a very culturally very conservative town, much more so than now, but we do have some. And when you see it, you'll know. This one on the left is a big, gorgeous deluxe house on Carnarvon Parkway, heading out of Belmead. On the right there is the I.T. Cresswell House on 16th, right adjacent across the street from the Fisk campus. It's a little jewel box. Little house built around a courtyard, absolutely stunning, just pristine and beautiful. But you see, I hope you can see what I'm talking about. Flat roofs, walls and windows, planes intersecting, no angles, no curves. Okay, next. So coming into what we see much more often here and also across the country is what we call contemporary or mid-century modern. Typical. Lots of big windows. You see the strip of windows there on the left to the right of the carport, a low pitch to the roof, and no historic ornament at all. The ornament is built into the house. This is out in the Bordeaux area. I've got a lot of these slides from Bordeaux because there's so many of these cool houses. This is a cultural phenomenon that is interesting to me. I live in College Hill, which is a very similar neighborhood to certain sections of Bordeaux, where affluent African Americans built houses before the discriminatory lending, the redlining, and the deed restrictions were finally outlawed, and the outlawing was enforced, plus or minus right around 1970. So there were areas that were developed by and for African Americans, and that's where they tended to build houses. You will not find any historic styles in these neighborhoods. These folks wanted to look forward, not backward. Backward meant discrimination and painful living. Forward meant hope for the future. So you see a ton of really cool mid-century modern in areas where affluent African Americans built houses. This is true all over the country. So we'll see a bunch in Bordeaux. This is a quintessential mid-century modern contemporary house. Next. So some more earmarks of this style. These houses are both on College Hill near me. Open roof line so that the living room is under the gable of both of these houses, and it has a high ceiling. There was no 8-foot cutoff and an attic. Lots of big windows and this projecting gable. Okay, next. Here is one. This is on West Hamilton Road in Bordeaux that combines flat roof on either side with a low-pitched atrium in the center. Next. And here and there, we get what's called a butterfly roof. These were really popular in Palm Springs, which was desert, which meant there wasn't much rain. Why anybody would build a house like this in a climate with 35, 40 inches of rain, I do not know, but I'm glad they did. I love driving by this house. There were several of these built out in Hillwood as well, and they're both torn down. This one is still here. It's in Bordeaux. I think whoever built this was crazy, but I'm glad they were. Next. So those mid-century modern houses, got to move on. Tons of these, you've all seen them all over town in older areas. They've got a lot of these in East Nashville, got a lot in Woodbine. There are a bunch in Inner Green Hills. I call this the post-war box or the proto ranch. There were thousands of these houses built between 45 and say 55, 1,000 square feet plus or minus, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, kitchen, living room, you're done. You might have a basement, you might not. It might be brick, it might be wood, it might be asbestos shingle, but they were plain, they were unadorned, and they were slapped up by the thousands in order to house new families because domestic construction had ended pretty much in 31, and it really had sort of picked up a little in the late 30s and then had ended again during the war. So there was 20 years of pent-up demand for housing. My parents had to live with my grandparents until they could find somewhere to live. And my sister, my older sister, was born while my parents were living at my grandparents' house because there was simply nowhere to go. So these houses were built by the thousands. I call them also the proto-ranch. Next. And we get to the ranch. Et voila, the bungalow of the 50s and 60s. Millions, millions, millions of ranch houses are built all over the country. There's not a county in the nation where you can't walk in a straight line more than 5 miles and run into a ranch house. They are everywhere. And they have some very specific characteristics. They're wonderful houses. I live in a 1962 ranch with a copper tone kitchen with the original appliances and these crazy colored bathrooms. I just adore it. There are some pluses and minuses to ranch houses. The characteristics tend to be that they are 2 rooms deep. When we see craftsman bungalows and older houses, they tend to be on narrow, deep lots, and they tend to be narrow on the street side and go back. We're reviving that with tall skinnies. But in this era, we were expanding into the suburbs and the outer suburbs. Land was cheap, and these were actually very wasteful of land. They required a big, wide, 200 square foot wide, 150 foot wide lot. Didn't have to be very deep. Tended to be arranged in almost every ranch had a very similar floor plan. There's a door. You see the door there in the middle or near the middle. On one side, in this house to the left, are the bedrooms. There were 3, sometimes 4 bedrooms, 2, sometimes 1.5 baths, generally a whole room bath and a bath connected to the master bedroom as a rule. To the right on this house was the living room, and beyond that was the dining room, often all in one room. And behind that, on the back of the house, was the kitchen and the family room. This is on a bigger house. When they got smaller, they didn't have quite as many rooms. But that was the general layout. And you parked your car either in a garage or a carport or something on the far end so that you could carry your groceries into the kitchen. That is every ranch that ever got built is more or less along these lines. And what kind of roof is that? That is a hip roof. And I would say all ranches have hip roofs, unless they don't. Next. So ranches came in all sizes. This one here on the upper one is from Charlotte Park. That's about maybe 1,500 square feet. Doesn't have that separate family room. It has 1.5 baths at most, might just have the hall room bath. But I'll guarantee you it's got 3 bedrooms. They were small, but there were 3. And it's got a living room, and it's got a dining area, and it's got a place to park your car. The one below is out off of Ashland City Highway in Bordeaux. That is a 4,200 square foot ranch. And I guarantee you the floor plan is almost identical, just more of it and bigger than the one above it. And what kind of roofs are those? Hip roofs. Next. Except when they don't have hip roofs. And here's one from Green Hills with gable roofs. Okay, it's still a ranch. And sometimes they were split level ranches. This one is on Geneva Circle, right across the street from me. It has since been painted gray. It looks dead and tired and old, and it just makes me ill. But okay, it's still a good house. Someday maybe the paint will wear off. Next. And we get stylistic mashups. What do we got on the one on the top? Would that be a temple form pediment? Neoclassical columns? Forget the American flag. That didn't come with it when it was built. We got a colonial ranch. We got a Greek revival ranch. It's nuts. It's out there. But I guarantee you that floor plan is identical to the others. And we got this this one from Creve Hall is just completely out of control. We've got a ranch. We've got an American eagle. That's that little brown spot above the bedroom windows is an American eagle. That didn't come with it new. owners put it up there. And we've got brick, we've got wooden siding, and we've got some half timbering there over by the garage. Just, you know, have at it, build a ranch, do your thing. Next. So this is one more ranch, but what kind of ranch is this? This is a mid-century modern ranch. There is this overlap. And this is a ranch, and I guarantee you this house, you go in that front door, you turn to the left, they're going to be bedrooms. You turn to the right, you're in the living room. You go a little farther, and you see over there on the far left, those are the dining room windows. Same floor plan, just a different stylistic influence. All right. Next, yeah. Okay, moving forward, going into the 70s, we find a style that was very popular for about 15 minutes, but we got a good bit of it here in Nashville out. I lived for a while at Harpeth Trace, which is up a steep hill off of Highway 100 out between Bellevue and Belmead across from Warner Park. Out in that neck of the woods and similar neighborhoods, we see a lot of these houses which were modern. They were clean cut and no fancy stuff, but they were much more closed in, at least on the front. They tended to be very open on the back, but closed on the street side. They used angles. You see the angle cut on the one on the right. It's no longer rectilinear, and used rough-hewn siding a lot, and the siding tended to follow the roof line. So there's a lot of diagonal siding. If you see one of those, you're going to call it California Contemporary or California Modern. That's just the name. Next. And here's one more out in the Haynes Heights area of Bordeaux. We've got a shingle, wood shingle roof, which was kind of typical, that goes almost out down to the ground. Very typical of California modern style. Next. So then the term modernism is so confusing. Postmodern architecture came into being from the late 70s into the 80s, 90s, and it was a reaction against the international modern style, the glass box. I won't spend much time on this. This was built as the new Third National Building. It's now the Fifth Third Bank Building on Church Street, and it's still a skyscraper. It's same materials, still tall, still mostly glass, but you see all the stonework and all this crazy decorative stuff down at the bottom. They were pushing back against the pristine glass box. This didn't last long. Next. Some more postmodern buildings. The Batman building is decidedly postmodern, much more decorative than the typical glass box, all these kind of angles and those silly things up on the top, and whatever. And then our downtown, the main library, this is my second least favorite building in the entire city. I absolutely despise the Schermerhorn, but we can discuss that over drinks. I mean, the acoustics are fabulous. You can hear somebody scratch their ankle, but it is ugly, 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 and badly planned. Anyway, postmodern in that they are coming back and pulling out neoclassical forms and doing all kinds of weird stuff with them. Moving on. Postmodernism, by the way, did not really filter out into domestic architecture. So we don't have anything, certainly not in Nashville, that we could term a postmodern house. But I said early on, we are now in a big revival period, architectural revivals. And the big thing, and the reason I spent so much time on the international style and the German modernists and all that is, that's where we are now. Every building that's going up at Nashville Yards, everything that's going up in WeHo, everything that's going up in the Central Business District is a revival of the international style. We've got glass boxes. Does that make sense? I happen to just love it. A lot of people don't. I'm a glass box fan, but irrespective of whether you like it or not, we are now in an international style modern revival. We are reviving modernism. Next. And this does filter out to domestic architecture. You know, we've got tall skinnies of all varieties, but we've got a lot of these that are neo-modern. Lots of glass, flat roof, no decorative ornament, everything rectilinear, no curves, no angles. Does that make sense? tons of these, more and more and more. These aren't very good examples. These are a couple of years old. I need to go out and photograph some more. Next. But we are also in this period, not so much now, but there have been a great many in the past couple of decades, re-reviving colonial revival. These are examples on and off of Bowling Avenue, but you've seen them, these colonial revival houses. Got a lot of that. Next. Also doing a good bit of Tudor revival. This is a fairly new house, been built in the teens in Green Hills. They're still building them. We've now moved into the white brick Tudor-esque era. I'm not sure what we're going to call those. I'll have to work that into the presentation next time. I don't know. Anyway, so we're reviving that revival, and we're reviving craftsmen. Who knew? These are tall skinnies in the Nations, both of these. Lousy photographs, I snagged them with my phone, but you'll see the earmarks of the craftsman style recast as tall skinnies. You see the houses on the left, you see those porch columns, wider at the bottom than they are at the top. That is ripped right off of a bungalow. We've got somewhat projecting eaves and that gable form on the front. There's not a bungalow on earth, an authentic craftsman bungalow that was built in this shape with the two-story one on top of the other, but that is craftsman style revived. The one on the left, what kind of gable is that? That is a jerkin head gable. And you see the little squeeny, they're squeeny and not authentic, but they're little knee braces, little brackets up under the eaves. The eaves don't project as far as an authentic craftsman, but by God, they slapped a bracket up there because we're gonna do the craftsman thing right. So we're reminded, this is the first revival of craftsmen. It's not a re-revival, it is a craftsman revival. Next. And then we get into stylistic mashups that I just can't even, the McMansion, y'all are on your own with McMansions. I can't, they're indescribable, they are nuts, they are out of control, they are, you can just say big, which is what they are. Frequently ill-planned, frequently not very well built, a lot of eye candy, but not much substance. And I'll take a listing on the McMansion of your choice, and by God, I will sell it as best I can. I don't have to like it though. Next. And in Williamson County, nothing succeeds like excess. And next. In Davidson County, West End Avenue, y'all, I don't know. These people were smoking hash. I'm sorry. And they're not even that nice on the inside, and they're selling like hotcakes at $1.2 million. So, okay. I'll be dead when somebody puts a label on this, and that'll be fine. I won't have to worry about it. Next. Oh, well, and this, I sent you the wrong PDF because this one was taken down because those buildings are already built, but move ahead. And these, I've got some resources for you, and I updated them, and I made a PDF out of the wrong presentation. So I will update that and get that to Rebecca so that if you want these slides in PDF form, you may have them. If you go back, there are a couple of websites that I've actually given names to in the updated ones. There's a Wikipedia article on architecture of the United States, and another one that is more aimed at domestic architecture that are really good if you're looking at a picture and you don't know, or looking at a house and you don't so much know what it is. These are great reference points. And just if you're interested, there are a couple of actual like books that are also good that I put on there. And there's me. And if you're stuck on describing a house, or you're not sure what it is, or if you're just curious, obviously I love to talk about this. So you're welcome to give me a call or send me an email, and that's my contact info there. And Rebecca can get you, anybody who wants it, Rebecca or I can send you a PDF of all these slides. And that's all I've got. And we're at 12:30, but we did start a little late, so I'm not, I'm not too far over time.
David, thank you so much. Again, I apologize to everyone for the for not being Teddy. But thank you so much, David. Oh my heavens. I'm not sure what my favorite thing is today, but self-conscious verticality is something I'm going to challenge myself to work in somewhere this week. That's my challenge.
Yeah, well, that is graduate school talk that I still haven't gotten over. You know, it's been nearly 50 years and I still, you know, I turn that on.
Well, like Hunter said this morning, pessimist always sounds so intelligent. I'm not a pessimist, so I'm going to have to find another way to sound intelligent. So I'm going to use that. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to show you real quick. I often get questions about where to find things, and I don't have it here. So, but if you go to the Village Market in the resources section, then you'll select Google Drive and it'll take you to Google Drive, and then for the Village Shared Google Drive, and there's a folder that has education handouts, and there's a short one-pager handout that David put together for this class, just for sort of a summary. There is some resources on different house styles, architecture styles. We will put the slide deck out there, which is in PDF format. And then separate from that is the Village YouTube channel. And Belle Flomerfelt from the East Office posts all of the recordings out there. And so you can go out and rewatch part of this. I will ask her to cut off the first 15 minutes where I'm floundering with technology, and so you can revisit any of these videos.
And if she wants to bleep out the S word,
I'm gonna gotta figure out how I can get a beep button on here. No, okay.
Sorry.
Hey, any questions for David? Any questions? There's probably lots. Oh yeah. Okay. So Emily says we just need to rate this one PG-13. That's a good idea. Good idea, Emily.
It does require a college diploma, a high school diploma to get your real estate license. So I'm going to assume everybody's over 13.
It just doesn't seem like it all the time.
Yeah, yeah, that's what both of my ex-wives will tell you.
Well, thanks again. Well, we'll get these resources uploaded to the Village Market, and Belle will have the video uploaded to the Village YouTube later this afternoon. If you have any questions, don't ask me. David Paine's your expert on this, and any feedback you have or questions, or just reach out to us and we'll get you an answer or some resources. All right. Thank you, David. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure.